Well, good morning, man. How you doing? Hey, thanks for letting us do this again this way. We'll see you in a few weeks, but until then, this is good, and I appreciate your hanging in there. I appreciate the discussion that apparently you had last week. This is a tough subject, and what you've been through in your trials, or what you may be going through now, is so significant in your walk with God that you deal with it the right way. And I think that's why James writes the way that he does in the first chapter, why he so quickly goes right to the subjects of suffering or afflictions or trials, difficulties, anything that is a hardship for his brothers and sisters. And he sends it out to all the 12 tribes dispersed, meaning he went out throughout the Mediterranean. Can you imagine them sitting there and reading his letter over and over and over again to pull the most out of it? And in a sense, that's what we're doing here. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about uh, some of the things that come up in the writing. But let's pause the video again briefly and have somebody pray for our time this morning. And if two of you would read James chapter 1, verses 2 through 5 in at least a translation of some kind and a paraphrase of some kind. And I hope by now you know the difference. All right. Thanks, brothers. Pause it now, and I'll see you in just a second. And you're back. It is such a great scripture. Let me read it to you in the New American Standard. Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. All right. We'll pick up from there in a later week, and we'll see how far we get today. I don't think very far, because there's so much here. I asked you to look at the verbs in these verses, and the first one is the word consider. I would guess that most of your, at least, translations have consider or know this. It might be. It's meaning it's a cognitive process. The first thing you have to do is, when you're going through something, is to stop and consider and think about what it is you're going through. All too often, we just run headlong into the circumstance or try and get out of it as soon as possible without learning or gaining anything from it. And if that happens, we're likely to go back to the same issue again and again and again until we get it. That's been true in my life and likely true in yours. So the first thing that James says is to consider or stop and think, cognitively think about what might be going on here. Let's ask some questions, and you can look at your notes here. Thanks, Bruce, for providing those. Your notes here. What are some of the possibilities of why I'm going through what I am? Now, you might not come to some definitive statement as to this is why I'm going through it. First of all, it's possible we may never know in this life. That as much as we would want to know and even ask God about it, his answer may be, you're going to have to wait on that one. This is something that it doesn't just involve you, involves a lot of people and how it interplays, and only God knows how that works. But you may not know until heaven. You may not know why someone got sick, why someone died, why someone went away, why you lost your job, why you had a particular illness, why bad things happen, why you suffer as a Christian, why you are persecuted. You may not know that. You may. And so we'll get to that in a minute about trusting him while we don't know, but at least let's stop and ask and consider what are some of the possibilities, and let the Holy Spirit speak through those possibilities as to, yes, this is part of the reason, or boy, that's it right there. And let the Spirit speak within that this is something that he wants us to know and learn. Again, remember, the goal is to be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing, to be a mature believer. And to be a mature believer means to understand what God is doing and to cooperate with his will, even in the hardest times, even if those times are planned by God. They're certainly allowed by God, but what if they were planned by God? What if he orchestrated a situation for something for you to learn, or some way in which he could strengthen your life? Let's run through some of those possibilities. One is, and let's face it, there could be some sin in your life that he wants to cleanse, something he wants you to conquer, and would purify you. It's a possibility. You don't always go there. Certainly be careful if someone is asking you why they're going through something, that you immediately go to that. Remember, that was the attitude in the first century. Why is this man blind, or why is this man lame? Well, he must have sinned, or his parents sinned. Who sinned? This man or his parents? And Jesus said, so that the works of God might be shown in him. It had nothing to do with his sin, but it could, and it's something to look at ourselves. Is there some sin that you want me to be aware of and deal with it as to why you are throwing this at me? Secondly, maybe there's some worldly habit that I have that needs to be contained, that requires some self-discipline. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the perfect and acceptable will of God is. Maybe there's some habit that he wants us to conquer. Thirdly, is there some character trait, some fruit of the Spirit that he wants to develop in us, some Christ-likeness that will be the end result if we cooperate with God in this trial, if we learn what we're supposed to learn. Number 4, is there some person or situation that we need to avoid? I know we've gone over Psalm 1, the first verse, many times. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the path of sinners, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. Take your time to read Psalm 1, and you see maybe there's a situation he wants us to avoid, or a person that he wants us to avoid. Fifth, maybe he puts us in a situation where we gain greater compassion for others in similar situations. That through our difficulties. And you see more and more that as you go through something, he points people to you who are going through that you can then help. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, blessed be the God of all mercies, Father of all mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we may be able to comfort others in any affliction with the same comfort with which we ourselves have been comforted by God. God teaches us something or comforts us through something, we gain a greater compassion for others. And there's a point where if we haven't been through it, we can't really counsel or support or offer grace to others in the same way. But boy, when you've been through it, you know. The best addiction counselors, in fact, usually the only addiction counselors, frankly, are those who have conquered an addiction. They alone know all the tricks of the trade. They know what you do to deny. They know what you do to get out of it. They know what you do and how you deal with people to get your drug or to satisfy your addiction. They know the consequences or the effect it has on the people around you. So they have more wisdom and more compassion because they've been there. Remember, Jesus was tempted in all ways like us, yet without sin. So he knows what we're going through, so he can offer what we need. He will allow us to go through things so that we can offer what other people need. You catch that point? And he will use it. He'll make you a magnet for that issue. You'd be amazed how people will come, and out of the woodwork, their need will be the same as yours was, and you'll be able to help them through it by what God has done in you. Right? Sixth, he may want you to be more dependent on him. He may put you in a situation, your trial may be where the rug just gets pulled out from under you and you have nothing of your own to stand on. You have to lean on God totally. And that's something that he has wanted you to do for some time. And instead of being propped up by the safety that you've created, a safe world that you've created financially or relationally or whatever, that he might pull that out from under you in order to fully or more fully depend on God himself, and especially not on others. Sometimes he'll pull others away when they become your gods. Even yourself can become your God, and you've relied on yourself and your own ability to get through situations, your own ability to think your way out of it or buy your way out of it, and he removes that, and you've got nothing but him to count on. I've been in that situation twice, and that was at least one of the major reasons why he allowed me to go through that. Out of his love for me, he wanted to create a greater dependence on himself. So that may be one of the issues. It may be that we, as we suffer, that we share the sufferings of others and the sufferings of Christ. Sharing the sufferings of Christ is something that we're called to do. Some of us have never known that kind of suffering. Some have grown up in a fairly safe world, don't understand fully, as if we ever could, about the sufferings of Christ and how great his love for us and what he did for us on the cross. And he may put us in a difficulty so we can have a better understandings of the sufferings of Christ. There are times, and I would say probably, I'm thinking back recently for me, my back surgery 2 years ago in November slowed me down dramatically. And my life was pretty active and full and busy, and maybe too busy and too active. And he allowed this situation to slow me down to where I couldn't do the things physically that I used to do. I had to depend on him, and gave me a lot of time on my hands. There was a lot of sitting around and time to read and time to pray and time to think and time to watch teachings. And he used that time to just slow my pace. That's one of the reasons that we're here in Florida, is to slow our pace and to be able to listen to God more closely. So that may be one of the purposes. Is he slowing you down by putting this difficulty in your life where what used to make you busy is gone, is taken away from you, or tainted or colored in some way? Maybe it's to show his strength in your weakness. You remember Paul had what he called his thorn in the flesh. We're not really sure what that was, but some physical illness or issue where he had to depend on God for it, and it showed how great God was in the middle of someone who doesn't have it all together. It doesn't have all the faculties that he'd like to have, doesn't have everything working for him. But God's strength could be shown through a weak person or a person in a weakened condition. That is a possibility. And I say there could be others, but number 10 is to learn not to complain. Is that at some point learn to yield to him and not to fight with him about difficult times coming as if we deserved better, as if we deserved everything to go well because we are his. A lot of verses on complaining. I'm going to let that go. But if you're a complainer, if you're someone who tends to be critical of a situation that you're in, unhappy with the situation, unhappy with the sovereignty of God, he will likely want to break you of that attitude in your heart. And the best way to do that is through difficulty where you're stuck and your complaining goes nowhere. And instead of gaining some people around you by complaining, it actually tends to push them away, at some point they kind of figure enough's enough. You just want to complain. You don't really want to get better or do better or conquer this negative attitude that you have about your situation. Instead of come to accept it and learn from it, maybe he wants to break you of having a complaining or a critical spirit. So, those are 10. I'd love to hear what others you have. I've left room underneath those 10 for some others that you come up with, and I would want you to share those with your brothers here today if you have other thoughts. So, number 1 is consider. Stop and think about what's going on. So, regular self-evaluation, regular stopping and considering, how is my life going? How am I moving toward my goals? Is there anything that's getting in the way? And if it's getting in the way, is that directed by God, or at least allowed by God to teach me something that I really need to know? God doesn't waste a whole lot of time. All right. If I'm going through something difficult, he's got a purpose in it. So God, what would your purpose be? Stop and consider. All right. The next verb is know. Again, it's a cognitive idea, but consider it joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. There are things we know about God and his purposes and how he works, his character, that should help guide us through our difficulty and not get into error of thinking God doesn't care, he's powerless, he can't do anything about this, the devil is stronger, or just lose faith in a God who loves you. Knowing is important. What do we know about God long before the situation happens that transcends the situation of what we might think we know, when right in the middle of it, our vision is so limited? But what do we know about God and ourselves as sinners? And what do we know about others and how relationships work, and depending on others versus depending on God? What do we know for certain that is true, that is absolute, that can guide us through the particular temporary situation that we're going through? And it's a great time to just stop and make a list. What do I know about God? David talked about him a lot in the Psalms, about his loving kindness and his mercy, and maybe get to know some of the terms that are used. He is my shelter and my rock and my fortress. A lot of metaphors are used. That's your God. And he didn't change because you're going through difficulty. If anything, the difficulty is geared to help you see that more clearly, to see who he really is, and to honor him for that. So what do I know about God? Consider know. And which means I can't go by my feelings and how lousy it feels, and feeling like I've been abandoned. Of course we haven't been abandoned. He'll never leave us or forsake us. The truth of Scripture is that you are never alone in what you're going through. He is always there with you and wants to guide you through the situation. So what do I know about him? Is he, is he cruel? Is he flippant with punishment? Does he care about what I'm going through? Of course he does. He's proven it time and time again. So you go back to what you know about God, and that's why it's so important to stay in the Word and learn about who he is and his character in different situations. What do I know that will guide me through this? What are some of the absolutes? So consider and know. And I think it's probably important to know what we don't know. I know I can't get a full handle on God. I know my brain cannot encapsulate all there is to know about God. And I have to know that, to know what I don't know. That, God, you're so much greater and bigger than I am. Your purposes are so much greater than excuse me, it is late for me. His purposes, to know them when I don't feel like he cares. I have to transcend my feelings to what I know to be true about him, and be willing to say, God, I don't know all of what your purposes are, but I trust you anyway. So know what you don't know, and verbalize that. God's timing is different than ours. When it comes, it seems to come bam, 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 time and time again, over and over. And some people seem to just get riddled with difficulty, while others seem to skate. There's a purpose in that. His purpose for them is different than his purpose for you. I need to know that about God, and know that I don't know all about him and everything that he does and why he does it. And I have to come to accept that, to be okay with that. So consider, know, and the third one that we will tackle today is the word let. Consider, know, let. Let endurance have its perfect result. It's actually part of the verb, but of being passive, or letting endurance have its result is passive, meaning it happens to me. It's not something that I actively do. God is doing his work, but it means I have to cooperate. I have to know that he's doing that and say, God, I willingly give this situation to you. I willingly give you this difficulty. Make it what you want to make it. I am cooperating. I yield to what you are trying to do here. Choosing to get through it rather than around it. Let me give you an example. There's a lady that I counseled for about 6 or 8 months, I think. And one of the issues that she brought was a difficulty she was having at work. She worked as a bookkeeper, sort of way in the back in a Chinese restaurant. And the owners of this restaurant were very harsh and with each other, actually. They were harsh to everybody, so she learned not to take it personally. I think I taught her that. Look around and see who's really skating here. Nobody. They were just hard people to get along with, hard on their own children, their adult children, their younger children, hard on their customers, and hard on their employees. And there was nothing she could do that was right. And she was wanting to be released from that job. But in praying about it, in seeking the Lord about the trial that she was going through, the Lord told her, no, I don't want you out of there. There's a purpose in your being there. I don't want you to quit and just walk away from it. I want you to stay until I tell you it's time to go. And she knew that very certainly, and she was obedient to it. She stayed there a lot longer than any of us would have, and stayed until actually another 1.5 to 2 years. And until actually the son took over the business. He was a little bit kinder, still not someone you warm up to very much, but she had learned to be submissive to Christ, to stay in a job where she wasn't valued like she should have been, wasn't treated like she should have been, and yet she could submit to them anyway. The Lord was teaching her something about submission and about depending on him and not on having the perfect job or having everything go well. It's okay for it to be difficult in the will of God. It could be the will of God for you to stay in a job that is difficult for an extended period of time. And he gave her, she prayed for it. She knew what was going on. She was very cognizant of that difficulty. She prayed for the wisdom to get through it until God released her from that job. And she managed it so well. Her coworkers would come to her and say, how in the world, when she berates you like that, which they did regularly, berated everyone. And she, believe me, she's a very hard worker and did an excellent job for, a lot less pay than she should have had. To be able to manage being treated poorly became an example to the other employees and led one of them to Christ. Now, who's to say if that would have happened had she just and left when she felt like it, when she wanted to. But she submitted her plan and her hurt to God's plan and God's loving kindness. And she stayed until he said, okay, now it's time to go. I learned more from her than I'm sure she learned from me. The Jews, as they were wandering in the desert, they didn't want to be there, but they had to learn to move when he moves and to stay when he stays. Remember, God showed himself in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. There was always something of him to follow, something very obvious and clear, but they had to learn to do it. They had to be willing to follow him, even if they didn't like it and didn't understand it. Why are we going in circles? We've been here before. Wait a minute. Yeah, you're going in circles until you yield, until you follow me and move when I move and stay when I stay. They had their lesson to learn, as we all do. It may mean staying in your situation a lot longer than you thought. Let me give you a personal example. I knew from actually before I got married, my first marriage, that it was going to be hard. And I'll just put it bluntly. I don't mean to speak against her. I was immature at the same. I just knew it was going to be hard, that the two of us were just not, when we were past if you want to say the honeymoon stage, when we were dating and getting to know one another and enjoying having a partner, I knew 2 weeks before we got married what a huge mistake it was. But good Christian men don't back out of a commitment like that and embarrass her that way on a small Christian college campus. So I said, well, God, I'll make of it the best that I can. And I'm not putting myself out as a hero here. I had a lot to learn about being a husband, about being a dad. But I did everything. I honestly believe I did everything I could to make that marriage work for 16 years. Every workshop, every seminar, read the books, the sermon series, the marriage series, counseling. It's a longer story than this, I'm sure you know, but I believe I tried everything that I knew and depended on God increasingly to give me the strength and the wisdom to be able to love my wife like Christ loved the church. It seemed to only make it worse. And there's no guarantee that if you're following God, it's going to immediately get better and everything will be well. It may not. In fact, in this case, it exacerbated things. And when I was no longer the target of her anger, she turned it on the children. And when I found out the children I knew that she was hard on them mentally, emotionally. But when I found out that she was beating them and refused to repent of that and deal with that, I had to provide a safe place for the children, and that was the end of the divorce. There were a lot of things that led to that, but I believe it was important that I listen to God and do what I could. And in that process, especially in the last 3 years of our marriage, I became a different person. I became more Christ-like, certainly more patient and kind, and wiser, more careful with my words, showing more grace, more self-discipline, steadier, something that she could count on. It wasn't enough, regardless. Nothing worked. In fact, tended to make things worse. But I still feel badly about how my marriage ended. I feel badly about some of my behavior in my marriage. I don't feel badly about all the attempts that I made to make it work and the decision that I made ultimately to file for divorce and to provide a safe place for my children. It took me a couple of years to get custody. That's pretty rare these days, and I think we were one of the first in California for a father to have custody of his 3 children at the time, to have primary custody and physical custody. So anyway, long story short, God did not release me from that relationship until I did everything that I could in his power. And he said, I believe he said, you've got to do this. You've got to get out, not so much for me, but for the children. And they were already damaged. And still, we talk about it fairly openly at this point. And they were actually fairly thankful that I made that decision. And God, of course, blessed me with Denny. We've been married 30 years now. And it's just been marvelous being married to her from day one. God is so gracious. But I don't think that would have happened had I not learned what I needed to learn by going through it, not around it. Not by bailing at the first sight of difficulty, but doing everything I could to honor my marriage and even honor my now ex-wife. So if that's a little too personal, everybody's got their own story on things like that, but learning to follow him in that was extremely important. We're going to stop there and deal with the last verb, asking, next week. And so we'll go more into depth about asking, seeking God, how to pray to him in the middle of difficulty, and how to listen. All right, so we'll stop there. But I've got a question for you. Break into groups like you did last week, depending on the numbers there. But try and keep the groups to 6 or 8. If you want them to be the same guys that were there last week, that might be a good idea, just because you've already started dealing with each other on a more intimate basis. So you might go ahead and break up into those groups. And I'd like you to, you dealt with the past. What was the most difficult trial you've ever experienced in my past? Now I want you to deal with, what am I going through right now that is difficult? And what do I believe God wants me to learn from it? What is most difficult that I'm going through right now? And do I have any clues as to, and use those 10 points that I gave you on considering what are the possibilities, and what do I know about God that will help me to go through it rather than around it and have to repeat the lesson? Because God will have us repeat the lesson if we don't learn it. So if you have that question, I'd like you to go ahead and turn the video off, and God bless you. I pray that this is a fruitful time for you, and we'll continue with this, with the next part in chapter 5 next week. All right. God bless you guys. Actually, I'll see you in a few weeks. All right. Love you. Bye.